It is a scene reminiscent out of the Cold War, and the message, well, it couldn't be any clearer.
Yeah, 3 Russian warships and a nuclear-powered submarine arrived in Cuba a few hours ago. They're taking part in planned military exercises in the Caribbean, but the real goal is essentially a projection of strength by Russia on the world stage. It's being very closely watched by the US, and it comes amid rising tensions between Washington and Moscow over, of course, the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, CNN's Patrick Ottman joins us now live from Havana. Patrick, this could be a conversation reminiscent of something we would have been discussing decades ago, and yet here we are. The U.S., we know, has been monitoring these ships very closely. Talk about the significance of it. The U.S. intelligence doesn't believe that these ships are armed with nuclear weapons. Nonetheless, just 90 miles off of the coast of Florida.
Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida and only about 50 yards from where I'm standing. Right behind me there are the 4 Russian naval ships that came into the port of Havana this morning. The ship directly behind me is a rescue ship, an icebreaker, which does not have much use in the Caribbean. And then behind that is a nuclear-powered sub, the Kazan, something Cubans say they've never seen before in this country, a nuclear-powered submarine coming in for all to witness into the port of Havana, really something quite unusual. And then behind is the Gorshkov, which is one of the most modern military ships capable of firing cruise missiles that Vladimir Putin possesses, really the highest level technology that the Russian Navy can boast. So those are for all to see. They are docked in an area a few years ago you would have seen American cruise ships, but because of U.S. sanctions, they're no longer allowed to come here. And right before we came on air, I could hear the sailors singing the Russian national anthem. So it certainly felt like a moment from the past. You know, it wasn't that long ago, of course, that the Soviet Union was supplying Cuba with everything they needed here, and the economy was doing much, much better as a result. We have seen some of that come back over the last few years with the war in Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin, in exchange for Cuban support in that war, has sent more oil here, more food. There are a lot more Russian tourists here these days, and that is helping Cuba as the economy is really in some of the worst stage that it has been in decades. Literally, Russian oil, in many instances, is keeping the lights on when they are on here. Because for much of the time, there are nationwide blackouts taking place. So Cuba has increasingly voiced its support for Vladimir Putin's invasion in Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin has returned the favor. Certainly striking to see the ships here behind me, armed with nuclear weapons or not, so close to the United States.
Yeah, and just obviously, yes, very alarming. But just in terms of what Cuba has said about this, Patrick, Cuba's essentially saying, look, this is standard practice. We do this frequently with countries that are sort of friendly to Cuba in terms of their own naval units. And as you pointed out, Cuba also saying that, look, there are no nuclear weapons on board the ship. There's absolutely no threat whatsoever. But still, talk us through how closely the U.S. Navy is watching this.
Well, the U.S. Navy essentially escorted them into Cuban waters as the ships, while they were in international waters, were essentially skirting the coast of Florida. So certainly they're watching them now. They will be keeping an eye on them if they depart from here and go to another U.S. adversary, the country of Venezuela. You know, the U.S. has naval maneuvers around the globe as well. They certainly have a much more active Navy right now than Russia's. So this is something these countries do. They keep a distance from one another as they shadow one another's ships, and there's a certain amount of professionalism there. And yes, it's true that many other countries send their Navy ships here on friendly visits, such as this one. They allow the Cuban public sometimes to board their ships, as we expect to take place later on in the week here with the ships behind me. But of course, the relationship that Cuba had with Russia for so many years during the Cold War is very, very different from those relationships. No other nation in the world has based nuclear warheads here. No other nation in the world was so supportive of Cuba. Cuba was essentially a client state of the USSR for many, many years. And you hear Russian officials saying that they want to invest more in Cuba, that they want to help the Cuban economy grow. But they also sometimes lament that Cuba remains a communist-run state and Russia is not anymore. So even the Russians, despite the years of that close relationship, have trouble making anything happen in Cuba these days, which really says a lot about Cuba's economy and the entrenched bureaucracy here. But Cuban officials saying that simply U.S. sanctions have pushed them back into the arms of their old ally. But of course, the economy in Russia certainly is very different these days. Russia no longer able to finance Cuba as it once did.
Yeah, Russia no longer a member of the G8 after its annexation of Crimea. It's notable that the President Biden, is meeting with his G7 now counterparts today in Italy. Patrick Ottman stating the obvious, no need for an icebreaker in the Caribbean, and yet there is one right behind you. Thank you so much.